Conor McGregor just gave an interview that nobody could have predicted 3 weeks ago. Talking about God. Talking about hitting bottom. Talking about forgiving himself for dishonoring the position God put him in. And then, in the same breath, breaking down why Topuria deserved exactly what happened to him at the White House because he never had a sparring partner willing to knock his teeth out for $1,000 cash. That contrast, the spiritual reflection sitting next to the casually brutal fight analysis, is the entire Conor McGregor experience compressed into a single conversation. And 5 years after the leg break that nearly ended his career permanently, he is 1 month away from finding out if any of it still works. Start with the return itself, because the framing McGregor gave for why now, why this fight, why after everything, deserves to be taken at face value before anything else gets layered on top of it. He said he is calm, serene, committed, that the motivation is not money, not redemption, not proving anyone wrong, though all of that is clearly present underneath the surface, but simply that he craves the competition itself. He said it directly. How many times have we sat here talking with nothing on the horizon, no date, no opponent, just uncertainty? Now there is a date. There is an opponent. And he described that specificity as genuinely exciting in a way that suggests the previous years of speculation and false starts were their own particular kind of psychological weight that he is relieved to finally set down. The explanation for what actually happened with the pinky toe injury that derailed the Michael Chandler fight is worth examining because it reveals something about how McGregor has historically approached his own training, and it is more specific than the public narrative at the time suggested. He described training without protective gear, cameras rolling for UFC content, intensity building during a flowing sparring session, and his foot connecting with his training partner's elbow at exactly the wrong angle. The fracture happened. The pain was severe. And with only weeks remaining before the fight, he made the decision that he has framed, in retrospect, as a hard lesson learned rather than simple misfortune, that he had been training in a way, throughout his career, where techniques in his arsenal would get damaged in practice and then have to be shelved because the injury risk of continuing to drill them was too high. He said the fight world has never seen many of the strikes he actually has in his repertoire specifically because of this pattern. Whether that claim holds up under scrutiny when he actually steps into the cage is the question that July 11th will finally answer after years of him making it. The doubt he has faced publicly, and he addressed it directly when asked about it, gets processed in a specific way that is worth understanding. He said doubt now is fuel. That whatever people say, positive or negative, does not affect him, that he stays centered. But then immediately afterward, almost contradicting the composed framing, he leaned into the doubt as motivation in exactly the way a competitor who has been hurt by skepticism typically does. The tweet he referenced, "They will respect my name," sits exactly at that intersection. A man who claims indifference to public perception while simultaneously building his entire return narrative around correcting that perception. The contract situation deserves direct attention because McGregor was unusually transparent about details that most fighters keep private, and the specifics reveal something about how unconventional his current arrangement with the UFC actually is. He confirmed he has 2 fixed dates already locked into his contract, July 11th against Holloway, and a second date in April of 2027. When asked why there would be such a significant gap between the 2 scheduled fights, his answer was telling. That is a question for the UFC, not for me. He does not know why the second date sits nearly a year out. He finds it somewhat absurd himself, but has accepted it as simply how the deal was structured. A fighter contractually locked into a date for a fight against an opponent that does not yet exist, with no explanation for the timeline, is not how this typically works, but McGregor's entire relationship with the UFC has never been typical. On the compensation question, McGregor was simultaneously boastful and evasive in a way that is characteristic of how he discusses money publicly. He confirmed he will be the highest-paid fighter for a single bout in UFC history for this fight, breaking his own previous records, in his words. But he refused to give an actual figure, deflecting with humor about his watch collection instead. He did make one specific comparative claim worth noting, that relative to boxers like Jake Paul, who have been pulling figures in the range of $60 to $75 million for major crossover events, he believes he is worth at least that much, and that promotions like those backed by Turkish investment have shown a willingness to spend at that level to support fighters. Whether the UFC's actual offer approaches that range is something he did not confirm, but the comparison itself signals where he believes his market value should sit relative to what combat sports outside the UFC structure are currently paying. The most substantive part of the financial conversation was his direct acknowledgement that he is simultaneously the highest-paid fighter on the roster and, by his own framing, still underpaid relative to his actual commercial value. That is not a contradiction he tried to resolve. He stated it plainly, that being paid 4 or 5 times more than anyone else on the roster and still being underpaid relative to what he generates is, in his own words, a unique and somewhat absurd situation. The negotiation process to get to this current deal, he said, was not particularly difficult. Both sides met in the middle. He confirmed the figure was not what he initially wanted, but called himself a fair person willing to compromise to preserve the relationship with an organization he said he genuinely loves and wants to continue working with. The reflection on the USADA situation and the New York Times reporting on his recovery deserves serious attention because his framing of it reframes the entire controversy in a way that the initial coverage did not fully capture. He described being airlifted out of the arena after the leg break with his leg literally hanging, with the only thing that mattered to him in that moment being whether he would walk normally again. He said there was approximately a 20% probability the bone would not properly fuse, a condition called non-union, which results in permanent lameness. That is the stake he says was on the table. And his argument, delivered with genuine frustration rather than performed outrage, was that the system as it existed at the time was structured in a way that did not adequately account for an athlete facing that specific medical reality. He said he listened to his doctors, did not ask detailed questions about what exactly was being administered, and simply wanted to walk normally again so he could play with his children. He emphasized a specific number repeatedly, that he has been tested 15 to 19 times in this calendar year alone, more than anyone else on the roster by a significant margin, and that across his career he has been tested somewhere between 50 and 70 times without a single positive result. His position on whether USADA's denial of the therapeutic use exemption was retaliatory is something he stopped short of confirming directly, but he did say he wonders whether USADA believes he personally cost them their contract with the UFC, and that there is clearly some lingering tension in that relationship that he insists has nothing to do with him as an individual fighter. His assessment of Ilia Topuria following the loss to Gaethje was the most candid and, in some ways, the most instructive part of the entire conversation, because McGregor was drawing directly from his own experience of what happens to a fighter who has never actually been tested before stepping into the deepest water the sport produces. He said Topuria has the same tattoos, says the same things, makes the same movements that drew comparisons to McGregor throughout his career, and then delivered the line that cuts to the heart of his actual critique. He said Topuria needed to get beaten up in the gym, that you need training partners willing to actually hurt you, and that he personally used to incentivize exactly that by offering cash, $1,000 on the spot to any training partner who could take him down. That specific detail, whether or not it is literally true in every instance, communicates something real about how McGregor believes elite fighters need to be tested in preparation in order to handle adversity inside actual competition. His read on Topuria's technical limitations was specific. Slow feet, walks forward with his hands down, vulnerable to exactly the kind of pressure that ends fights, not a fully complete fighter despite being good. And his prediction about the psychological aftermath was direct, that Topuria will be in a dark place right now, that he has never actually drawn his own blood inside the Octagon before, unlike McGregor who has been there exactly once. He said Topuria has the capability to come back from it, but that the climb will require something he has not yet had to demonstrate. The comments on the broader state of the UFC product, specifically his criticism of the White House card despite acknowledging its operational success, are worth examining because they reveal how McGregor thinks about star building as distinct from event execution. He was clear that the production itself, given the obstacles of weather, location, and logistics, was genuinely impressive. But his specific criticism was that the card failed to elevate its own talent in front of an audience that size, that there was an opportunity to build stars by putting UFC fighters in proximity to other major combat sports figures and entertainment personalities in attendance, and that opportunity was not used effectively. He noted that he might have been invited himself and did not attend, framing his absence not as a snub, but as a practical decision tied to ticket sales considerations given his current standing relative to a full live gate draw. His broader argument was about reinvestment, that the UFC, sitting on roughly $1 billion in value with $100 million in cash profit from the prior year, should be spending significantly more on production elements like live music and full spectacle for every single show, not just the marquee events. He framed it directly. You want Super Bowl numbers, you do not get them once every 3 years, you build them every week. On Max Holloway specifically, his actual opponent for July 11th, McGregor's assessment carried the specific edge of a man who has already beaten this opponent once and does not see enough evolution to change his expectation of the outcome. He acknowledged Holloway has added elements to his game since their previous encounter, crediting some of that growth to the lessons Holloway took from the first fight against him. But he was direct that he does not see enough difference to change the calculus. He referenced Holloway's 5-round fight against Ian Gary as evidence that the southpaw matchup remains manageable, and confirmed this will be his first fight, cutting down to 170 pounds specifically for this bout. The personal dimension of this return carries weight that deserves acknowledgement beyond the competitive framing. McGregor confirmed that none of his children or his wife attended his last fight, a deliberate choice at the time given the danger inherent in the sport. He is reconsidering that decision for this fight specifically, citing a desire to have his children witness firsthand what total commitment to a goal produces, in hopes of inspiring them toward their own pursuits. He discussed his son's developing interest in football, his daughter's involvement in camogie, and his approach to coaching his children directly, drawing on his own extensive background in athletic development and conditioning. He was direct that family life, rather than distracting from his training, has actually anchored him during this camp in a way that previous training cycles lacked. The closing exchange about Khamzat Chimaev and Islam Makhachev revealed that McGregor has not abandoned his championship ambitions despite the framing of this return as simply about competition for its own sake. He said directly that he would pursue the belt, that he believes he would beat Chimaev relatively easily, and that he remains open to a fight with Makhachev given their shared history and his familiarity with Makhachev's training partners. The man who spent most of this interview describing inner peace and spiritual recalibration closed it by confirming he still wants the gold, still believes he can take it, and still sees both current champions as opponents he would accept without hesitation. 5 years removed from one of the most catastrophic injuries in the sport's history, Conor McGregor is 1 month from finding out whether any of what he believes about himself still translates into the cage. The interview revealed a man processing genuine personal transformation alongside completely unchanged competitive conviction, someone who talks about touching bottom and finding God in one breath and then, in the next, explains exactly how he would slap any heavyweight in the sport regardless of size. Whether that combination produces the dominant performance he is promising, or whether 5 years away from elite competition has eroded something the spiritual language cannot fully repair, is the only question that actually matters on July 11th.